Hi folks, my name is Caitlin Bland. I have an MA in Sexuality Studies from San Francisco State University, and my work kind of looks at the ways that public violence is utilized to further a white heterosexual mandate in the United States. But specifically for today, I want to talk a little bit about alt tech and how alt tech is used as a community making and identity making practice on the internet. All right, so as I said, I kind of want to look at how alt tech markets itself as a space for discourse and free speech, but ultimately serves to kind of create white-only spaces on the internet. So alt tech came about because of an increasingly more popular tactic of deplatforming nationalist and white supremacist users on more common internet sites. So companies like Twitter and Facebook have begun to deplatform members of the alt and far right. And because of this, it's kind of created this push for this last bastion of free speech on the internet in what they view as an increasingly moderated world. Particularly, you can see discourse around censorship in ways that suggest that white supremacy and nationalism is being shoved out of the internet. So you start to see these creations of websites like Gab and Parler that market themselves as free speech, non-politically correct spaces where these conversations can happen for the users. And ultimately what happens is that these spaces become increasingly white-centered and heterosexualized in these tech spaces, regardless of maybe the broader interest in these kinds of ideologies. So I think that what's important here is that we kind of start with spaces on the internet that made space or made alt tech possible. And I think that one of the biggest sites here, or the biggest structures here, is called the manosphere. And the manosphere is a broad term for sites on the internet that are generally structured around anti-feminism, sometimes an explicit hatred of women, and is really a site for men only. And through these sites, like Men Going Their Own Way, Return of Kings, incel.com, they create and reinforce identity and community based on a shared sense of how they connect to their gender, to their race, and to their sexuality. So many of these sites are spaces where men are talking about how they fall short of expectations of masculinity, expectations of whiteness, expectations of sexual accessibility, right? And they ultimately become sites of validation as well. So these men are engaging in conversations where they're validating their shared worldview and coming to a sense of bonding, a sense of community based on that shared worldview. Now, some of these practices are interesting. So you'll see men sharing pictures of themselves and comparing kind of their jawlines or the tilt of their foreheads in ways that reinforce this idea of kind of biological superior maleness, right? And so these men will take pictures of themselves and share them in spaces in the manosphere to describe how they fall short. And then people will respond and kind of validate their experience. You know, yes, your jaw is tilted this way, and so that makes sense why you are don't have sexual access to women. So these practices are deeply heterosexual, right, and deeply intertwined with our concepts of what it means to be a man. They ultimately create identity and community. This is where men are figuring out what it means to be a male, what it means to fall short of what it means to be a male, and how they bond with each other through this. And one of the more powerful ways that this bonding takes place through shared language. And I've included some down here in the slide. You have words like normie, which discuss people who are outside of this kind of structure of the manosphere. You have the term femoid, which is the derogatory term for a woman. You have the term Chad, which specifically means a white, conventionally attractive, sexually active male, right? And they have racialized terms for men of color who are sexually active, conventionally attractive. And then you have these red pill and black pill concepts, and these are all over the manosphere and all over alt tech as well. And these kind of refer to this idea of a coming to awareness, right? When you're red pilled, you've come to this awareness that the structure of the country and the world is what they call gynocentric or female centric. And the black pill is really a more nihilistic view of that, this idea that there will be no changing of that men will always be on the outs, always be at the bottom, and that the world will continue to be run by women and other people that they deem undesirable. So oftentimes like what they would consider unattractive men or men of color. So given that these are these practices that are occurring in these spaces like the manosphere and alt tech, how are they recruiting people? What are these tactics that are used in order to grow their user base and make this really kind of a powerful corner of the internet? One of the more insidious tactics is this use of language shift based on the platform that these groups are kind of using to appeal to certain audiences. So on spaces in the internet that are explicitly alt or far right, you see the kind of language you would expect to see there, pretty nationalist, pretty white supremacist. But if you see the posts that they're taking from there and putting on sites like Twitter and Facebook, they've shifted the language to appeal to different audiences. So you'll start to see things like Southern heritage or tradition or history instead of other, maybe more explicitly white supremacist terms. And this really grows their user base, right? Because the words that are used are emotionally connective words for a different audience that may not feel comfortable utilizing some more clearly white nationalist language. And then another powerful part of this is that the use of the internet moves so much faster than either the regulation or teaching can, right? So alt-right and far-right groups will move from platform to platform to maintain communication faster than sites can kind of come to terms with the movement, right? So this adeptness at utilizing the various pieces of the internet in order to maintain community is far faster than any kind of response that can be generated, right? And ultimately, it's through the use of humor and memes that transmit to their broadest audience, right? Everybody's seen memes. They're generally, if you have access to the internet, they're easily accessible. They're pretty easy to understand. They're funny. They're visually engaging. And they're everywhere. They're on every part of the internet, right? And so it's this use of humor and this use of memes that feels really innocuous, but it is ultimately spreading kind of a white nationalist, white supremacist worldview. And this can get in the hands of really young people really quickly, right? And the more comfortable you get with seeing these jokes about the Holocaust or seeing these jokes about the uselessness of women, right? The more you grow up and finding that humorous, the easier it is to start to ingrain that in your day-to-day life. And that's a quite insidious piece of the use of alt tech spheres in the ways that they can transmit to other parts of the internet. So ultimately, this is all a question about the internet, right? It's about how we're using it. It's about how we're thinking about it. The internet is powerful. It has the potential to reach a massive audience. It can pick at individuals and collective groups, right? And the internet is pretty transparent if you choose it to be, right? So you can put personal information on the internet, and you can put information about your community on the internet, and the alt-right can pick up on that and find the site of your grievance and can tailor their message to you in order to entice you into joining into this kind of larger ideological structure. And as I've said before, law and education move much more slowly than the internet does, and the tactics of the far right and the alt-right on the internet. With all of this being said, of course, the question is, in what ways can we combat this? In what ways can we reduce the power of the alt-right and far right on the internet? I think the most important place to start is with abolition, right? So abolition is deeply entwined with these concepts of race, gender, and sexuality, right? So race, gender, and sexuality are really punishment centered. The punishment comes from either inaccurately performing your role as either like a man, woman, a white person, or from occupying like an undesired role. So punishment comes when these things occur, and you learn very quickly to expect punishment for certain behaviors within these realms of identity. So if we were to address this punishment-centered structure, this framework, we can begin to address what might push people to far and alt-right spaces, particularly on the internet. We have to address why individuals and why communities might be turning to alt tech. What is alt tech offering them? Or what do they feel that they need or can get from alt tech that isn't made possible elsewhere? And ultimately, we need to address the communities that are harmed by these tactics online. And these need to be focused on reparative justice, right? Rather than a punishment-centered response, as we've learned that it is the punishment that kind of fuels this cycle. So we need to figure out how to address harmed communities and address this movement to alt-right, and ultimately incorporate an abolitionist perspective into the way that we relate to the internet, the way we relate to gender, sexuality, and to race. And I think one of those important ways to do it is to see what the far right and alt-right are doing, and to format counter tech tactics in order to change the way that the alt-right is structured online. So I would start with looking at these tactics that the alt-right and far right are using and utilize them. You know, we look at the potential of memes and see the power that they can have in kind of creating this utopian world building capability through this like visual power, right? We can create the world we want to see, and we can disseminate it through the use of memes, right? Easily accessible packages, they're funny, they're interesting, and ultimately they're engaging and far-reaching. A counter response utilizing humor and attention to the crises that communities and individuals feel that they're facing will provide ways to disrupt alt tech, right? To prevent that from being a pathway for people. And when you prevent that from being a pathway for people, you ultimately reduce the space available for alt tech online. You reduce the power, you reduce the capability of their reach, because we've addressed the communities first. And I think that that's a perfect starting point. I want to thank all of you for listening to me today. And then if you're interested, I do have my bio up on San Francisco State, and you can contact me there if you'd like. Thank you all so much.